The Vanishing Trail. In the dense forests of Oregon, there's a trail that locals warn never to take after dark. The path, known as Whispering Pines, has been the source of countless disappearances over the years. The trees, towering and ancient, seem to close in as the sun sets, their branches forming a canopy that blocks out the stars. Sam, a seasoned hiker, had heard the stories but dismissed them as folklore. He was drawn to the challenge of the trail, eager to conquer what others feared. With a backpack full of supplies and a sturdy pair of boots, he set out late in the afternoon, determined to reach the summit by nightfall. As Sam ventured deeper into the forest, an unsettling silence took hold. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves. Though there was no wind, he brushed it off, attributing it to his nerves. But as the hours passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The trail began to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks seemed to move, and the path ahead constantly shifted. Sam's unease turned to panic when he realized he had been walking in circles, though he had never left the trail. Desperation set in as darkness fell, and Sam's flashlight flickered ominously. He could see his breath in the cold night air, but the forest around him remained unnaturally warm. Then, just ahead, he saw a figure, a man standing still at the edge of the path. Relieved, Sam called out, but the figure didn't respond. As he approached, the man turned, revealing a face twisted in terror, eyes wide with an expression of unspeakable horror. Before Sam could react, the man vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. A chill ran down Sam's spine as he realized the truth. The stories weren't just legends. The trail was alive and it fed on fear. His heart pounded in his chest as the trees seemed to close in around him, the path disappearing beneath his feet. Sam tried to run, but every step felt like he was sinking into the earth, the ground softening into a mire. The whispers grew louder, echoing in his mind. Words he couldn't understand but that filled him with dread. Sam's vision blurred, the world around him spinning. He collapsed, the weight of the forest pressing down on him. As consciousness slipped away, he saw them, dozens of eyes watching from the shadows, each pair belonging to a lost soul claimed by the trail. When morning came, the forest was peaceful once more. The sun filtered through the trees, and birds sang in the branches. There was no sign of Sam or the trail he had followed. Only the locals knew the truth, passing down the warning to never stray into Whispering Pines, especially after dark. The trail was patient, always waiting for the next wanderer to lose their way. The Clockmaker's Curse. In a small, forgotten town in Massachusetts, there stood an old clock shop at the end of a cobblestone street. The shop, owned by Mr. Henry Caldwell, had been there for generations, passed down from father to son. Henry was a master clockmaker, known for his intricate and beautiful designs. But there was one clock that was different from the rest, one that no one ever dared to touch. The clock was massive, its dark wood frame covered in elaborate carvings of twisted figures and strange symbols. It had been in the shop for as long as anyone could remember, though no one knew who had made it or how it came to be there. The townsfolk whispered that it was cursed, that the clock could steal time from those who tampered with it. One rainy afternoon, a young woman named Emma walked into the shop. She had recently moved to the town, unaware of its dark history. She was drawn to the clock, mesmerized by its eerie beauty. Ignoring the warnings of the locals, she approached Henry and asked if the clock was for sale. Henry's eyes darkened, and he shook his head. "That clock isn't for sale, miss. It's not safe." But Emma was persistent. She offered a large sum of money, more than Henry had ever been offered for any of his other clocks. Reluctantly, he agreed to sell it, but not before giving her a stern warning. Do not wind the clock no matter what. It must never be set in motion. Emma dismissed his concerns as superstition and took the clock home. It fit perfectly in her living room, its ominous presence adding a strange charm to her otherwise cozy home. For weeks, she admired the clock, but curiosity began to gnaw at her. What harm could come from winding it just once? One evening, unable to resist any longer, Emma turned the key and wound the clock. The gears groaned to life, and the clock's hands began to move, slowly at first, then faster and faster. A deep, resonant chime echoed through the house, sending a shiver down her spine. At first, nothing seemed amiss, but soon strange things began to happen. Emma would lose hours at a time, entire afternoons slipping away in what felt like minutes. She found herself waking up in the middle of the night, the clock's chime filling her dreams with a sense of impending doom. She started to age rapidly, wrinkles forming on her once youthful face, her hair turning gray. Terrified, Emma returned to the clock shop. But when she arrived, the shop was gone, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. She asked the townspeople about Henry Caldwell, but they all looked at her with confusion. No one had heard of him or his clock shop. It was as if it had never existed. Desperate, Emma tried to destroy the clock, but it was indestructible. No matter what she did, the clock continued to tick, its hands spinning faster and faster. The chimes grew louder, drowning out her thoughts, consuming her every waking moment. As the days passed, Emma grew weaker, her body deteriorating at an alarming rate. She knew her time was running out, but she was powerless to stop it. The clock had claimed her, just as it had claimed others before her. On the last night of her life, Emma sat in front of the clock, watching as the hands reached midnight. The final chime echoed through the house, and with it, Emma's life slipped away. The clock fell silent, its hands frozen at 12 o'clock. The next morning, the clock was gone, leaving behind an empty space where it had once stood. The townspeople found Emma's body, aged beyond recognition, her face twisted in a final expression of terror. And so, the cursed clock continued its journey, moving from place to place, always finding a new victim. It was patient, biding its time, waiting for the next curious soul to wind its gears and unleash its deadly curse. The shadow beneath the lake, Lake Crescent, nestled deep in the Pacific Northwest, was a place of serene beauty. The water was so clear that on calm days, you could see the bottom, littered with ancient stones and fallen trees. But the lake held a dark secret, one that the locals rarely spoke of and only in hushed tones. For generations, there had been rumors of a shadow that lurked beneath the lake's surface. Some said it was a creature, others believed it was a curse. Whatever it was, those who saw it never returned the same. The shadow was said to appear at dusk, just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the mountains. Jake and Lisa, a young couple from Seattle, had heard the stories but dismissed them as local folklore. They decided to spend a weekend at the lake, eager to escape the city and enjoy the tranquility of nature. They rented a small cabin near the shore and spent their days hiking and their nights sitting by the fire, enjoying the peace and quiet. On their second evening, as the sun began to set, Jake suggested they take the canoe out for a quick paddle before dark. Lisa hesitated, remembering the stories, but Jake laughed it off, teasing her for being superstitious. Reluctantly, she agreed, and they set out on the still waters. As they paddled deeper into the lake, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the water. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring the shoreline. Lisa felt a growing sense of unease, but Jake was undeterred, paddling further out. Then, just as they reached the center of the lake, they saw it, a dark shape moving beneath the surface. At first, it was just a blur, a trick of the light. But as they watched, the shadow grew larger, more defined, circling the canoe like a predator stalking its prey. Lisa's heart raced as she frantically paddled back towards the shore, but the shadow followed, keeping pace with them. It moved with an unnatural speed, darting beneath the canoe and sending ripples across the water. Jake tried to reassure her, but his voice wavered with fear. Suddenly, the canoe lurched violently, as if something had struck it from below. Lisa screamed as she was thrown into the freezing water, the cold shock stealing the breath from her lungs. She surfaced, gasping for air, and saw Jake struggling to stay afloat as the shadow closed in around them. Panic set in as Lisa tried to swim towards the shore, but the water seemed to pull her down, as if the lake itself was alive, determined to claim her. She felt something brush against her leg, a cold, slimy touch that sent a jolt of terror through her body. The shadow was beneath her now, rising from the depths, a dark, shapeless mass that blotted out the light. Jake's cries for help were swallowed by the fog as the shadow enveloped him, dragging him under the surface. Lisa screamed his name, but there was no response, only the eerie silence of the lake. She felt herself being pulled down, the icy water closing over her head, the world above slipping away. Just as she thought she would drown, the shadow released her. She broke the surface, coughing and sputtering, and looked around wildly. The canoe was gone, and so was Jake. The lake was calm once more, the fog lifting to reveal the distant shoreline. In shock, Lisa swam to the shore and collapsed on the pebbled beach, shivering uncontrollably. The police were called, but there was no trace of Jake or the canoe. The locals offered their condolences, but their eyes told a different story. They knew what had happened, but no one would speak of it. Lisa left the town the next day, haunted by the memory of the shadow beneath the lake. She never returned to Lake Crescent, but the nightmare followed her, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just below the surface. The room with no doors. In the heart of New York City, there stood an old apartment building known as the Camden Arms. Built in the early 1900s, it had seen countless tenants come and go over the years. But there was one apartment on the top floor that had been empty for decades. Apartment 7B. The building's landlord, Mr. Thompson, was a grizzled old man who had managed the Camden Arms for over 40 years. He knew every tenant by name, every creak and groan of the ancient structure. But 7B was different. It was the one place he avoided, and he made sure no one ever rented it. No one knew why 7B had remained vacant for so long, and those who asked were met with a stern warning to stay away. The few who had ventured inside quickly left, pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what they had seen. One winter evening, a young artist named Olivia moved into the Camden Arms. She was drawn to the building's historic charm and the affordable rent, unaware of the dark history that lingered within its walls. Olivia had recently gone through a rough patch and was looking for a fresh start. The apartment she rented was on the 6th floor, directly below 7B. As she settled in, Olivia couldn't help but notice the strange noises that seemed to come from the apartment above her. At night, she heard faint whispers and the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth. She mentioned it to Mr. Thompson, who quickly dismissed it as the building settling, but his anxious expression told her otherwise. Curiosity got the better of Olivia, and one night, she decided to investigate. She climbed the stairs to the 7th floor, the air growing colder with each step. When she reached 7B, she was surprised to find the door slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment was eerily silent, the air thick with dust. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, as if frozen in time. But something was off. There were no windows and no doors except the one she had entered through. The room was a perfect square, with no sign of how it could have been part of a larger apartment. Olivia felt a wave of unease wash over her as she walked further into the room. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air grew heavier with each passing moment. She turned to leave, but the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, seamless and unbroken. Panic set in as Olivia realized she was trapped. She pounded on the walls, screamed for help, but no sound escaped the room. It was as if the very walls absorbed her cries, muting her voice to nothing. The whispers she had heard at night returned, louder now, filling the room with their dissonant chorus. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and Olivia could see her breath in the frigid air. The shadows in the room began to move, shifting and twisting into grotesque shapes. She backed away, her heart racing, as the shadows coalesced into a figure. A tall, thin man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. The figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice a rasping echo that seemed to come from all around her. "This room was never meant to be found." Olivia tried to speak, but fear had stolen her voice. The figure reached out, its skeletal hand brushing against her cheek, leaving a trail of icy numbness in its wake. She recoiled, but there was nowhere to go. The room was closing in, the walls pressing tighter, the ceiling lowering as if it intended to crush her. Desperate, Olivia closed her eyes and wished for escape, but there was no reprieve. The figure's cold touch crept up her arm, and she felt her strength leaving her, as if the room itself was draining her life away. The whispers grew louder, drowning out her thoughts, pulling her into a void of darkness. When Olivia was finally found, she was lying in her bed, her body cold and lifeless, a look of pure terror etched on her face. The police could find no cause of death, and the coroner's report was inconclusive. But Mr. Thompson knew the truth. 7B had claimed another victim. The next day, the door to 7B was sealed shut, and the keys were thrown away. The Camden Arms continued to stand, a relic of the past, but the story of apartment 7B became just another urban legend, whispered among those who dared to believe. And the room with no doors waited, patient and silent, for the next soul to wander too close.